You'd think by now, the indie boomer shooter renaissance would be old hat, and developers would have moved on from trying to recreate classic experiences like Doom. In the AAA space, id Software got so far away from the more simplistic thrills of Doom 2016 with Doom the Dark Ages, a game that feels completely at odds with not only itself but the legacy of the franchise it hails from. In the indie space, we've seen teams attempting to recreate games like Half-Life, Fear, and we've even gotten sequels to Wolfenstein 3D that inject modernity into their design. Despite starting from the premise and even mimicking some classic shooters, Cultic also represents another shift away from strictly traditional shooter design. Developed by JSAWS Games and published by 3D Realms, Cultic was announced back in 2021, with its first chapter becoming available on October 13th, 2022. The idea was that roughly a year later, the game would get its second chapter as DLC, and the structure would start to mimic that of classic shooters. While it took another 3 years to cross the finish line, a lot of that is down to how much more vast and differently structured Chapter 2 has wound up. What began as simply being a retro throwback evolved into something far grander in scale, and one that actually eschews traditional boomer shooter design in favor of something more evil. Resident Evil! Silly joke aside, Cultic represents a rather interesting bridge between its obvious inspiration of Blood and its aesthetic atmospheric one in Resident Evil. It plays like a true fusion of the franchise, something Capcom hasn't even managed with its first-person RE games. When Cultic's first episode hit the scene, I wasn't in an active position at any outlets to review it. I probably wouldn't have anyway, because I prefer reviewing throwback games like this as an overall whole rather than in chunks. There is some logic to taking things piecemeal, however, as Cultic's 2 episodes sometimes feel like different games. Both share the same kind of progression and level design philosophy, but Chapter 1 is a relatively brief 4-hour jaunt that almost feels a little rushed when it comes to its design. It was very much meant to be a companion to something else, which would have originally seen Cultic be a roughly 8-hour game when all was said and done. The first chapter begins with a cutscene detailing the overall narrative of Cultic, which involves cults doing cult shit in worship of some unseen cultic god. You awaken in a corpse pile after said cult dumped you thinking you were dead, but clearly they have another thing coming. Across 10 levels of grit and grime, you'll do battle with cultists, ghosts, bizarre mutated creatures, and a grotesque final boss that actually takes a ton of inspiration from Resident Evil 4 more than classic shooters. The arsenal feels like something Monolith would have included in a Blood sequel. We don't acknowledge Blood 2. Right down to having throwable TNT bundles that can obliterate packs of enemies in a single toss. There's a speed and ferocity to combat that is matched by the overall difficulty Cultic has. If you're familiar with the old Build Engine games, which included Duke Nukem 3D, Shadow Warrior, Blood, and a few others, you'll know that hit-scanning enemies were an absolute nightmare because of how accurate and fast they were. Blood pumped that up to an absurd degree, but Cultic is like playing Blood on its extra crispy setting. If you aren't moving in Cultic, you're taking damage. When you do move, you'll have to be smart about the path you take, because cultists are rather incredible at leading shots and lobbing projectiles where you want to be. Crouching plays a vital role in combat, and swapping weapons to better deal with specific threats is much more emphasized here. It could be thrilling and exhausting in equal measure, which makes playing through each location enticing. The arsenal isn't especially unique in the grand scheme of things, but it's balanced well and no one weapon ever feels useless. You start out with literally nothing but your fists, which I suppose is worthless, but the axe you pick up soon after is given more versatility by having an alternate fire that allows you to throw it. You could stock up to 10 of them, and with how strong they are, it often behooves you to use them on lower level threats. Your next weapon is a pistol modeled after the Mauser C96, which was the Red 9 in Resident Evil 4. Because of how frequent pistol ammo is, and how accurate the gun is, it pretty much becomes your workhorse weapon in every situation. Upgrades later down the line make it even better. Following that, you get a double-barreled shotgun that could fire a single barrel or both at once, a Sten Mark II that uses pistol ammo but deals out fast damage, a rifle with magnum rounds for longer distance carnage, a grenade launcher for instantly clearing crowds, an incinerator to really drive home the blood comparisons, and for setting foes alight, an FG-42 paratrooper rifle that allows for scoping, and Molotov cocktails for closer ranged fire needs. It's an incredibly well-rounded arsenal that, when a few extra weapons are added in Chapter 2, They almost feel a little redundant. These weapons act as replacement swaps for the axe, pistol, shotgun, and sniper respectively. For reference, I played the campaign through on the very hard difficulty the first time out, and across both chapters, Cultic almost plays like a survival horror game. You aren't getting jump scared or truly starved for resources, but health is at a premium, and if you aren't careful with your shots, you will wind up needing to axe a large portion of foes. The atmosphere takes on a more sinister vibe, and the proceedings almost feel like classic Resident Evil games with how slowly you scout out areas before engaging in firefights. In certain situations, I didn't feel I had enough ammo to drop everyone, so I'd avoid fights altogether by running past enemies. Cultic incorporates a few elements from immersive sims by allowing you to utilize props in the environment. If you see a chair sitting in a bar or a lantern placed at a campsite, you can grab those and hurl them at foes. Lanterns obviously erupt into flames, but chairs can outright kill enemies if hit from far enough. Given that ammo is never overly plentiful until later levels, it becomes crucial to your survival in the early game. The first chapter is very quaint compared to the second, but there are still some set-piece moments to bring up. At roughly the midpoint, you'll engage in a rather thrilling shootout at a church that culminates with a tank rolling up on you. There's also an extended sequence in a dark sewer where light is at a premium and navigation demands you sink to the depths below before rising again. Despite having a similar color palette and motif the whole way through, Cultic does manage to mix things up on a purely level-to-level basis. Chapter 2, however, is almost entirely different. It starts off with a similar low-key atmosphere before quickly erupting into shootouts, abandoned towns, dilapidated amusement parks, Spencer Mansion-like fortresses, and even an entire segment that seems dedicated to condemned criminal origins. Spread across 12 levels, Chapter 2 took me roughly 9 hours to finish, and while it does wrap up everything nicely, you could play it individually and get a full experience. Its inspirations are farther reaching than just Resident Evil, though there is very clearly a love for Leon's first foray into the series. Some of the overall issues I had with Cultic really take their form in Chapter 2. At times in Chapter 1, there will be instances where the game throws you into a scripted sequence where you can't save at all, and it just throws wave after wave of enemies at you. That's fine in principle, as these areas act as skill checks. The problem is that resources are so limited, and enemies so damned accurate, that unless you're on the ball at every moment, you're likely going to die and have to restart the entire process. The final boss of Chapter 1 is one such point, though his health bar isn't so ridiculous to make retries feel arduous. In Chapter 2, however, these segments happen more frequently and are much longer in comparison, that each one winds up feeling like artificial padding. Cultic isn't built like a classic run-and-gun shooter, and while Blood also had scenarios with large mobs of enemies coming at you, you were never forced to deal with things without proper health or ammo. Cultic wants to simultaneously be a brutally hard old-school shooter while letting you indulge in Rambo-esque power fantasies, but doesn't correctly balance those two desires. An Old West-style town in Chapter 2 nearly broke me, but the ultimate final boss really took the cake. For the sake of being thorough, I replayed certain chapters on hard difficulty, and it's actually astonishing how much of an impact that has on gameplay. Below its two uber settings, Cultic does wind up feeling more like Blood. Putting aside some accessibility options that can tweak matters further, the hard setting is akin to Doom's ultra-violence and allows you to more freely run and gun like a madman, even if you can't throw caution to the wind completely. Very hard, conversely, is what I'd call the survival horror setting that demands near perfection and can drag out certain sequences. An even tougher extreme setting exists, but I couldn't manage to progress past the first level's final battle, so I gave up on that. I bring this up because while I have some issues with Cultic, I do think a lot of them were exacerbated by the setting I was playing on. I don't think the game is perfect even on a more reasonable difficulty, but things like repetitive encounters and puzzles being a little brain dead don't ruin an otherwise great time. A boss fight against a mutated helicopter taking me nearly an hour to finish does, but bosses are much more reasonable when you're not trying to prove something to yourself. The game is clearly beatable on very hard, since I did it, but just know that you'll need to swallow your pride at times and take a step back to make it through. Let me not forget to mention some performance issues, which will hopefully be patched out in the future. At times, the game suffers from slowdown, but it doesn't manifest as a lowered frame rate. Cultic almost skips around when doing it, making me think I was losing my mind when my character started jolting forward. The only other thing I can mention of note is that Cultic has come at a time where boomer shooters have nearly reached a saturation point in the indie scene. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually wouldn't mind if more developers attempted to break away from the old school episodic structure in favor of a more streamlined Half-Life approach to campaigns. Cultic is a solid example of how to blend these two, and while I understand why it ended up with distinct halves, excluding the interlude chapter that is absolutely worth playing, I do wonder how it would have fared as a continuous experience. It doesn't truly utilize each episode to present unique experiences, even if they might feel like different games. Overall, I've found Cultic to be very good, though. It's been a while since I've had a shooter kick my ass like this, and I appreciate that JSAW's Games hasn't dumbed down combat in order to reach a broader audience. There are 5 difficulty levels to pick from, so if you're worried that I've described Cultic as some masochistic experience, don't be. Easy mode nearly feels like cheating, but even that doesn't make the enemies utterly incompetent. You'll still be challenged enough, just not to the point of wishing death would take you from this world. With all of that said, I heartily recommend Cultic to anyone with a penchant for classic FPS games and Resident Evil alike. It's not exactly what I expected, and it could sometimes be repetitive, but Cultic is worth overcoming those issues to see its interesting blend of styles and genres. It does Monolith Productions proud, and I really hope that one day we can see a new Blood game just like this.